All romance novels are superficial, badly written excuses for fiction. They're only a reflection of the author's desires and a way for readers to escape their tedious lives. That's what many critics and the general public seem to believe, but I have a different perspective. Hi, I'm Juliet. I have a degree in language and literature, and throughout my college experience and my entire life as a reader, I've had a question. Are there any good romance novels? I remember one time when I was in class and we were studying Jane Austen, and my teacher said, I want something to be clear. Jane Austen wasn't a romance writer. And she said this with such disdain, as if believing Jane Austen could have written romance was an insult to her memory. I do understand that if you conceive all romance novels as supermarket paperbacks that dedicate an entire chapter to describing the hero's abs, you wouldn't want to position Jane Austen in that genre. However, in that same class, my teacher established that the main themes in all of Austen's books were marriage, money, and social mobility. And I agree, but it's fundamental to clarify that all of Austen's arguments revolve around marriage for love. And if the main theme of a novel is love, then you might be reading a romance novel. But really, what is a romance novel? Defining the romance genre is complicated. Critics heavily disagree on its essence, one of the reasons being that it is very prolific. In A Natural History of the Romance Novel, Professor Pamela Regis establishes that a romance novel is a work of prose fiction that tells the story of the courtship and betrothal of one or more heroines. Although Pamela Regis is praised for developing one of the first serious analyses of romance novels, her book is a couple of decades old, and you can tell. It is extremely heteronormative, and it places an excessive relevance on marriage, in my opinion. I think the focus should be on the feeling of love, regardless of gender, sexual orientation. So I would say the defining factor of a romance novel is that its main theme is romantic love. But before answering the fundamental question of this video, there are some relevant aspects to consider first. How did romance novels come to be, and why is such a popular genre so widely criticized? The beginnings of the genre. To understand a genre, it is important to know its history. Many scholars agree that the first romance novel was Pamela or Virtue Rewarded by Samuel Richardson. This novel was published in 1740, and I read it, yes, all 800 pages of literary torture. Richardson intended to educate readers, particularly women. He aimed to expose attitudes and values that young ladies were supposed to imitate. But from today's perspective, this can be a bit problematic. Let me explain. Pamela is the story of a young maidservant who works for Mr. B, a wealthy man who tries to seduce her. The protagonist is an idealized lady who treasures her virtue, that means virginity, because culturally that was women's most important value. Mr. B repeatedly tries to abuse Pamela, but she resists, and eventually he decides to marry her because she had proven worthy of an upperclassman by protecting her virtue. Yes, this is how romance novels started, teaching important lessons to young girls. As problematic as this book might seem from a current perspective, Pamela was a working girl who married a gentleman. Considering the historical context, it is a pretty favorable ending for her because of women's limited options. I mean, it would have been better to marry a man who didn't abuse her, but that's not what Richardson wanted. But what does this mean for the genre? Well, frequently there's a tension between the main character, who tends to represent an ideal model of femininity, and the various social and cultural limitations imposed on women. The requirements to remain a virgin until marriage, or the difficulties of social mobility, are elements that come into play in this love story. Truly, there's not a lot of love in this novel, but there's another detrimental factor that affects how we conceive romance novels: reception. Romance is an incredibly popular genre. According to Reader's Digest, romance is still the most read genre in 2025. A tendency I've observed has been maintained at least for a couple of decades. But popularity doesn't guarantee acclaim or even acceptance. The genre is constantly described as soppy, cliched, trashy, but is it fair to apply these characteristics to all romance novels? When analyzing the critical reception of the genre, Pamela Regis notes, some of these critics make statements about the romance in such a way that the entire genre is characterized negatively by its association with the few texts that a critic mistakes as representative. Additionally, I have observed that many people have such a rigid preconception of romance, they exclude any notable authors or pieces of fiction from the genre. And don't you think the fact that this genre is mainly written by women, about women, for women, has something to do with its rejection? Well, criticism of romance novels can hide a misogynistic perspective. In Dangerous Books for Girls, Maya Rodel establishes that women read and write these novels has led to the notion of romances being women's work, and it has been devalued accordingly, in the same way as teachers, nurses, and other typically female-dominated industries. Instead of understanding the variety within this genre, which can include relevant pieces of fiction, it is dismissed altogether as superficial stories only meant to entertain bored girls. But romance novels can center on the theme of love while questioning social conventions. And if there's one iconic author who wrote novels about the courtship of a lady, strongly focus on how society could be restraining for women, and how the possibility of choosing who to marry was liberating, that is Jane Austen. I believe Jane Austen was, indeed, a romance writer. Why? Because love is the main theme in all her novels. Pamela Regis is with me when she clearly states, Jane Austen is the master of the romance novel. Austen's arguments revolve around marriage, love, and social status, the entangled elements that determine any lady's life at the time. But in her stories, marriage is always a question of love. Jane expressed her beliefs in a letter sent to her niece, in which she wrote, anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. However, simple love stories aren't precisely what made her one of the greatest writers of all time. Among other distinguished characteristics, her ironic questioning of the role of women and marriage made her novels outstanding. But her stories go beyond commentary on social conventions. Austen dramatizes a woman's right to choose freely based on a sensible and intelligent analysis. Back then, marriage was probably a woman's most important choice because it would determine the conditions of her entire adult life. The fact that her novels prioritized love over a convenient alliance was a significant gesture that demonstrated trust in women's feelings and intellect. We can perfectly see this in Persuasion, which I chose to analyze mainly because I didn't feel like reading Pride and Prejudice for the third time. Persuasion follows Anne Elliot, who was shortly engaged to Frederick Wentworth, but Anne had been persuaded by her family to end the relationship because of Frederick's lack of wealth and social status. 8 years after their separation, we find Anne having to move out of her family estate because of their declining economic situation. Turns out, the family who rents her house is related to Frederick, who is now Captain Wentworth, and has become wealthy because of his actions in the Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. The argument of this novel focuses on a second, well-thought chance at marriage and love, when the protagonist is more mature and can prioritize her desires over the opinions of others, which were based on antiquated beliefs. Persuasion is a romance novel that is intrinsically associated with social issues, as it explores the tensions between the nobility and the people who didn't have a rank. The novel begins begins by exposing how Anne's father, Sir Eliot, was extremely proud of his position as a baronet, and it is clear that he felt a certain disdain towards people of lower position. Anne distances herself from this superficial perspective. She can recognize the true value of someone's character regardless of their birth, which is proven when she chooses a sensible and clever man, disregarding the suggestions to marry the heir to their estate, her cousin, who was not an ideal man. In the introduction to Persuasion, Elaine Jordan highlights how this novel presents a subtle, sharp kind of feminism, when female characters question traditional ideas of women as creatures of little thought, which, as you can imagine, was pretty subversive for its time. Regarding romance novels, or novels in general, Austen had a few things to say. Alright, Northanger Abbey, her parody of gothic and sentimental books, clearly defends novels in a period when they were considered inferior compared to poetry or history. The protagonist, Catherine Morland, is an avid reader, but she tends to be ashamed, fearing criticism. However, the narrator defends the honor of novels. Although our productions have afforded more extensive and unaffected pleasure than those of any other literary corporation in the world, no species of composition has been so much decried. From pride, ignorance, or fashion, our foes are almost as many as our readers. Even though this is not specific to romance novels, there is a clear connection with a female audience, whereas poetry or history were associated with male readers. However, Catherine's love interest, characterized as an intelligent man, enjoys reading novels, including those traditionally considered feminine, and the characters who disliked this type of literature were portrayed as ignorant or hypocritical. I think I've made my point regarding how, like any other genre, a romance novel can discuss with the culture of its time, and even with subsequent periods, instead of only functioning as a way of escapism. But are there any more good romance novels beyond Jane? I think Jane Austen is the typical example when thinking of a romance novelist who developed an intelligent social critique. But of course, there are more examples. I won't dive too deep, so this video isn't too long. But I've thought about Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which follows a lifelong love story while exploring many aspects of Colombian culture. Some people consider Atonement by Ian McEwan, one of my favorite books of all time, a romance novel. And although the love story is fundamental to the plot, I don't think it fully belongs to this genre. I would appreciate it if you could recommend some good contemporary romances, because I haven't had any luck, especially when trying to read the super viral books we all know about. What is a good romance novel? To answer the big question of this video, yes, I believe there are good romance novels. Of course, there are bad romances as well. The problem is that people have such a negative preconception of this type of literature, they exclude any good novels, and often they select poorly written books as a representation of the entire genre. Additionally, misogynistic views have influenced the way romance novels are perceived. But if we can move past that, we can find many amazing books that explore the complexities of love in relation to other relevant aspects of human experience. Love can be political, and its representation can be meaningful in a way that exceeds the private relationship between two people. This was my first YouTube video, so if you liked it, I would really appreciate a like and a comment. And of course, I would be incredibly happy if you subscribed. Thank you for your time and see you soon.